Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on a topic that's, well, it's kind of a big deal. Human rights.
It is.
We know a lot of you listening are deep in international relations, maybe even prepping for the UPSC exams. And if that's you, hey, think of this deep dive as like a cheat sheet for one of your recommended texts.
So that's a good way to put it.
But honestly, even if you're not studying for exams, getting a grip on human rights is like essential to understanding the world.
Absolutely. It's about, how we view humanity itself. Like, do we all have inherent value? What do we owe each other? It gets pretty philosophical,
It does.
especially in our globalized world.
And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Yeah.
Our deep dive is based on excerpts from a text that really breaks down this huge topic.
Yeah.
The evolution of human rights, the different types, and the serious challenges they face.
It's dead stuff. So we're here to kind of distill it down for you, and we'll be tackling some seriously thought-provoking questions, like how did we shift from believing rights were God-given to creating this whole global human rights system, our economic rights, things like healthcare and education, as important as political freedoms. What happens when a country simply can't afford them? Can we really apply the right to peace or the right to development to entire societies? Stick with us, and hopefully you'll leave with more questions than answers.
In a good way, of course.
Exactly, in a good way.
So it's not just about memorizing facts, right? It's about getting those nuances, those debates, and forming your own, informed opinions.
Yeah.
So let's rewind the clock a bit. Where did this whole concept of human rights even come from?
Well, for centuries, international relations was all about states, it was their chess game. Individuals, not really the focus. But even way back then, many cultures had this sense of individual worth, often tied to religion, like rights were granted by a higher power.
So how did we go from, God-given rights to something more universal?
That's where natural rights come in. Thinkers like Grotius, Hobbes, and Locke over in Europe, they argued that some rights are just inherent to being human. They're not given by any ruler or government. They just exist.
Okay, I'm following.
Take the right to life, for example. There wasn't always a law that explicitly said it. But isn't it something we just inherently understand as essential?
Yeah.
Like, deep down, we all know certain things are just wrong, no matter what the law says.
It's like our moral compass or something.
Right. And documents like the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, they really amplified these ideas, put limits on state power, and put individual autonomy front and center.
So these weren't overnight shifts, right? It was process.
Oh, absolutely. It took global movements, like abolishing the slave trade, and efforts to regulate warfare, especially given how brutal things were in the 19th and early 20th centuries, to bring those ideas to the forefront of international relations.
And then World War II, the horrors of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
I mean, that had to solidify the need for a global human rights framework, right?
Absolutely. The atrocities of World War II were a wake-up call for the whole world. And that's where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights comes in.
Okay, the UDHR.
Yep, the UDHR, born in 1948, outlining for the very first time a comprehensive set of rights for every human being.
So this wasn't just some philosophical statement. It was a turning point
Oh, a major one.
in how we viewed international relations. So the UDHR was like saying, okay, world, we need some ground rules. States can't just act with absolute power anymore. Individuals have rights, and you have to respect them.
That's a perfect way to put it. The UDHR introduced this idea that states aren't all-powerful. Individual rights became a competing principle to state sovereignty.
Which I can imagine creates a lot of tension.
Oh, with that.
Because states are still trying to protect their own interests. It's like this constant balancing act between the rights of individuals and the power of states.
Exactly. And that tension plays out in so many ways, especially when we look at humanitarian intervention, which we'll get to later. But first, let's unpack those different types of human rights this framework covers.
Okay, because it's not one size fits all, right?
Not at all.
And UPSC aspirants, this is where those generations of human rights come in, each representing different historical influences and values. It's not just a random list. It reflects how our understanding of human rights has evolved.
Right. And the first generation focuses on what we call liberal rights, your civil and political rights. These are all about protecting individual liberties from the government overreach. Think freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to a fair trial, protection from torture. The government's role here is mainly to stay out of your way.
Basically, don't tread on me.
Exactly. We call these negative rights.
Okay, so the government's supposed to leave you alone, let you
Yeah.
live your life, but obviously within the law. But hold on. What about a fair trial? Doesn't that require the government to actually do something?
Good point. Even within this first generation, there are some positive rights where the government needs to step in. Like a fair trial needs a functioning court system.
Right, so it's not always so black and white. Now on to the second generation, economic, social, and cultural rights. These feel a bit more socialist, wouldn't you say?
You could say that. These rights emerge from critiques of, capital systems and inequality. We're talking about the right to work, education, healthcare, social security. They require the government to actively provide services, regulate the economy to ensure well-being.
So it's not just about the government keeping their hands off. It's about them actively creating conditions for a decent life.
Right. And that's where things get a bit tricky. Critics argue these rights are expensive, especially for developing countries. And then there's the question of responsibility. If a state can't afford them, who's responsible? Other countries, international organizations, individuals. It's a big debate.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there. Okay, so we've got the government staying out of your business, the government actively helping you out, and then there's this third generation solidarity rights.
These sound a bit more, abstract.
Yeah, they are complex. They focus on collective rights rather than individual ones. They came from the concerns of the global south. Think decolonization movements. And they include things like the right to self-determination, peace, development, environmental protection, even cultural preservation. It's about the rights of groups of people or even whole societies.
So this is where things like the right to self-determination fit in. This was huge for countries breaking free from colonial rule.
Exactly.
But how do you actually implement a right to peace? What does that even look like in practice?
That's a great question, and it highlights one of the criticisms. Against third-generation rights, they can be vague, difficult to translate into concrete policies and action. Measuring something like the right to peace is a huge challenge. It seems like with each generation, the idea of human rights gets more complex, and the debates get even more intense.
Oh, absolutely. And this leads us to another critical point, the tension between human rights and something called humanitarian intervention. It's one thing to say these rights exist, but what happens when they're violated? What if a state itself is doing the violating?
Oh, that's where things get even more complicated.
Yeah.
We're talking about potentially intervening in another country's business,
Yeah.
which directly challenges that whole idea of state sovereignty.
Exactly. Humanitarian intervention is this idea that the international community has a responsibility to protect populations from severe human rights abuses, even if it means stepping on a state's toes.
So when is it okay to step in? And who gets to decide that? Those are some pretty weighty questions.
They are indeed, and that's why the debates around humanitarian intervention are so intense. We'll dive deeper into that in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at real-world examples and the arguments for and against intervention. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into human rights. Before the break, we were talking about humanitarian intervention and how it clashes with this idea of state sovereignty.
It's a tough one, On the one hand, we've got this long tradition of not interfering in the affairs of other states.
Right, the whole sovereign nation thing.
Exactly. But then you've got situations where a state is actively harming its own people, committing atrocities. What's the international community supposed to do? Just stand by and watch?
Yeah, it's a real moral dilemma. Is it ever okay to intervene in another country's affairs, even if it's to protect people from harm?
And even if we do intervene, how do we make sure it's not just powerful countries, pushing their own agendas under the guise of human rights?
It's like might makes right all over again.
Exactly. Especially when you think about history, there are so many examples where intervention, even when it's well-intentioned, has actually made things worse.
It's like walking a tightrope.
That's a great analogy. There are no easy answers here. The track record on humanitarian intervention is, mixed. Sometimes it has saved lives, prevented more suffering, but other times it's backfired, led to longer conflicts, and even more human rights abuses.
So how do we even start to make sense of this? Are there any, guidelines or frameworks to help us figure out when intervention might be justified?
Well, some argue that intervention is only okay in really extreme cases. Genocide, crimes against humanity, really widespread, systematic violations.
The worst of the worst.
Exactly. But others think it should be considered more broadly, like when a state fails to protect its own citizens from internal conflict.
Yeah.
Or even natural disasters.
So it's a pretty wide spectrum. And how do we guarantee that these interventions are actually motivated by, a genuine desire to protect people and not political or economic self-interest? Because let's be real, those motives aren't always clear-cut.
Right, and skeptics will argue that powerful countries often use the language of human rights to justify interventions that actually benefit them strategically.
It's all about resources, trade routes, maintaining that geopolitical influence.
Exactly. It's not always about altruism.
So how do we make humanitarian intervention more effective, less prone to abuse? Is there a way to find that balance between protecting people and respecting sovereignty?
Well, one idea is to strengthen international institutions
Yeah.
and legal frameworks. A good example is the responsibility to protect doctrine.
Okay, UPSC folks, R2P, this is a big one. Tell us more.
So R2P basically says that states have the primary responsibility to protect their own citizens from things like genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. It's about holding states accountable first and foremost.
So it starts with the state itself getting its act together.
Right.
But what happens when they can't or won't protect their people?
That's where R2P gets interesting. It recognizes that if a state fails to protect its citizens, the international community has a responsibility to step in. Ideally, this would be through peaceful means. But R2P acknowledges that force might be necessary as a last resort.
So R2P is trying to strike that balance between state sovereignty and the responsibility to protect human rights. Has it worked?
Well, R2P has its critics, for sure. Some say it's been applied inconsistently, often invoked by powerful states to suit their own political interests. There's always that risk that it could be used to justify interventions that aren't really about humanitarian concerns.
Right, because who gets to decide when R2P applies? And what about those who argue that any intervention, even with the best intentions, is just another form of imperialism?
That's a valid concern, absolutely, and one we need to address head-on. Historically, humanitarian intervention has been tied to colonialism and imperial ambitions. Even today, there's a risk that interventions will be seen as neo-colonial, especially when they're led by Western powers.
So how do we ensure that humanitarian interventions are seen as legitimate, genuinely motivated by a desire to protect people? How do we get buy-in from the international community?
One important step is to make sure interventions are multilateral, meaning they involve multiple countries, and that they happen under the umbrella of international organizations, like the UN.
So it's not just one country acting alone.
Right. It's about getting the whole global community on board.
And what about regional organizations?
Oh, they're crucial too. Involving them in planning and implementing interventions helps to make sure that the interventions are sensitive to local contexts and don't accidentally make existing tensions worse.
Right, because sometimes those good intentions can backfire.
Exactly.
And speaking of actors on the ground, what about NGOs? They're often the ones providing aid directly to people in need.
NGOs are absolutely essential partners in humanitarian interventions. They often have deep roots in communities, understand the local context, and can provide vital assistance. But even NGOs face challenges. It's not always easy to navigate those complex political environments and make sure aid is delivered fairly and effectively.
It sounds like a real balancing act.
It is.
Coordinating all these different player states in international organizations, NGOs. How do we make sure everyone's on the same page?
That's the challenge, right? Effective humanitarian intervention needs close coordination, cooperation among a lot of different players, and everyone involved has to be genuinely committed to upholding human rights and finding a peaceful solution.
Right. So we've talked about the theory,
Yeah.
the frameworks like R2P, some of the challenges. But let's get real. Can you give us an example of how this plays out in the real world?
Sure. One of the most high-profile examples of R2P being invoked was the intervention in Libya back in 2011.
Oh, Libya.
Yep.
That was a complicated one.
It was. There was a popular uprising against Muammar Gaddafi, and it quickly turned into a civil war. Gaddafi's forces were accused of some pretty horrific human rights abuses, including attacks on civilians.
And there were fears they might massacre people in Benghazi, which was a stronghold of the opposition.
Right. So the international community, citing R2P, authorized the use of force to protect civilians. A NATO-led coalition launched airstrikes against Gaddafi's forces, which helped the rebels gain the upper hand.
But it wasn't without controversy, right?
Definitely not.
Some argued that it went beyond protecting civilians, that NATO basically became air support for the rebels.
Exactly. Libya really shows just how complex and controversial R2P can be. It might have prevented a humanitarian disaster in Benghazi, but it also led to regime change and years of instability in Libya.
And it raises those questions about the long-term impact of humanitarian interventions. What about rebuilding after a conflict? What about helping a country create a stable government? Those are huge undertakings.
You're right. Libya reminds us that interventions, even when they achieve their immediate goals, can have unintended consequences that can last for years. It's something we have to think about very carefully.
It seems like this whole discussion comes down to one question. How do we balance the need for state sovereignty with the responsibility to protect human rights? In a globalized world, it's not an easy question.
And there's no easy answer. But by having these tough conversations, by looking closely at the motivations behind interventions, by learning from the past, both the successes and the failures, we can hopefully move towards a world where human rights are truly protected and respected.
We've covered a lot on humanitarian intervention, the justification, the challenges, the reality. But before we wrap up this deep dive, let's bring it back to the bigger picture. So we've explored this whole world of human rights, from their historical roots to the different generations, and this super thorny issue of humanitarian intervention. But before we wrap things up, I want to emphasize something for our UPSC aspirants out there. This isn't just theoretical stuff, you know. Human rights are at the heart of international relations.
Absolutely. They're woven into how the world works.
It's not about just memorizing definitions for an exam. It's about understanding how these concepts actually play out in the real world.
Right? In conflicts and international organizations and domestic politics, it's about connecting the dots.
So if you're prepping for the UPSC, this deep dive is like a primer on one of your key texts. But it's also about going beyond the textbook and seeing how these ideas show up in current events.
Exactly. Think about the conflicts happening around the world right now. Many of them are rooted in human rights violations. The refugee crises, the humanitarian disasters, the calls for international intervention. Understanding human rights gives you a framework for analyzing these situations.
It helps you understand why states choose to intervene or not intervene in a particular conflict.
Right. What are the human rights implications of their actions? It's all connected.
And it's not a static field either. Human rights are always evolving.
Oh, absolutely. New challenges are popping up all the time. The impact of technology on privacy, freedom of expression, the rights of refugees and migrants, even environmental rights, in the face of climate change.
So as our world changes, so does our understanding of human rights.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to engage with these issues critically. Question your assumptions. Be open to different perspectives. Don't be afraid to challenge conventional wisdom.
Okay, before we let our listeners go, let's recap. What are the key takeaways from our deep dive into human rights? What do we absolutely need to remember?
First and foremost, human rights have come a long way. They've evolved from, religious beliefs to this complex, often contentious, international legal framework. That Universal Declaration of Human Rights, while not legally binding in itself, has become a cornerstone of international law, a moral benchmark for how we treat each other.
It's like setting the bar for global behavior, even if not everyone reaches it.
Exactly. And remember those different generations of rights? Civil and political, economic, social, cultural, and solidarity rights. Each reflects different values and priorities, and often they clash with each other.
Like that debate about economic rights, access to healthcare, education. Are they as fundamental as political freedoms?
Right. And of course, we can't forget that tension between state sovereignty and individual rights, humanitarian intervention, while aiming to protect people, raises tough questions about justification, decision-making, and preventing abuse for political gain.
It's a lot to think about, but it's essential knowledge, especially if you're a UPSC aspirant facing that international relations paper.
For our UPSC folks out there, remember, human rights aren't just a topic in a textbook. They're a living, breathing, evolving aspect of international relations. Engage with the material critically. Apply these concepts to real-world events. And most importantly, develop your own informed opinions. It's not about rote memorization, it's about critical thinking.
Great advice. And for everyone listening, engaging with these ideas doesn't end when you close a book. It's about being an informed citizen, thinking critically about what's happening around us, and working towards a world where everyone's rights are respected and protected.
Well said. And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive into human rights.
We hope you found this exploration insightful and thought-provoking. If you're eager to learn more, be sure to check out the show notes for additional resources and further reading on this topic.
And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging with this complex and ever-changing world of international relations.
Until next time, keep diving deep, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. We'll be back with more fascinating topics, from global economics to climate change. See you soon.